On the morning of December 6th, 1999, Loch Lomond in Scotland was calm and still, the water reflecting the winter sky like a sheet of glass. A group of divers entered the loch for what should have been a routine training exercise. They expected to recover old fishing nets, car tires, or broken bottles, the usual debris that collects in the water. But what they found instead would horrify them for the rest of their lives. As one diver swam closer to a black plastic bag snagged on the rocks, he assumed it was nothing more than trash. When the bag was torn open, something pale slipped out and brushed against his leg. At first, he thought it was a piece of wood wrapped in fabric, but the shape was wrong. The weight was wrong. And when the beam of his flashlight revealed it clearly, his body froze in disbelief. It was not driftwood. It was a human leg, cut clean. The skin bloated from the water. In that moment, the divers realized they had not uncovered an accident. They had uncovered a crime scene. And this was not one body. This was a body in pieces. On December 7th, only a day after the divers' discovery, a man was walking his dog along the loch shoreline. His dog began barking at something in the reeds, pulling its owner toward a bag tangled in branches. Thinking it was litter, the man ripped it open. What he saw inside nearly made him collapse. A human head stared back at him, distorted by days in the water. The face was bloated and unrecognizable, the features swollen to a grotesque mask. By the afternoon, police confirmed the horrifying truth. Multiple bags had been dumped into Loch Lomond, each containing a different part of a human being. Arms, legs, now a head. When the story broke, newspapers seized on the phrase that would come to define the case: limbs in the loch. The name was unforgettable because it captured exactly what had been discovered. Not a whole body, but dismembered fragments of a life that had been violently stolen. Forensic specialists worked quickly. On December 8th, dental records confirmed the identity of the victim. His name was Barry Wallace, and he was only 18 years old. Barry was a quiet young man who lived in Kilmarnock. He worked part-time at a Safeway supermarket, saved what little money he earned, and kept mostly to himself. His friends described him as shy and awkward, but always polite and kind. Just days earlier, on December 4th, Barry had attended his workplace Christmas party. For once, he seemed relaxed. He was smiling, laughing, even dancing with his co-workers. Witnesses later remembered that he had been drinking, but nothing suggested he was in danger. When the party ended, Barry left alone, walking into the freezing night. The next morning, on December 5th, his family noticed he had not come home. At first, they believed he might have stayed at a friend's house. But when Barry failed to show up for his next shift, they grew worried. Within hours, their worst fears were confirmed. The head found in Loch Lomond belonged to their son. The press coined the name "Limbs in the Loch," and the public could not escape it. Each new day brought fresh headlines, each one hinting at more fragments recovered from the water. Police divers described the horror of their work, pulling up bag after bag, never knowing what part of Barry's body would emerge next. For weeks, Loch Lomond transformed from a scenic landmark into a crime scene. Boats combed the surface. Divers mapped the depths. Families living nearby watched in fear as police carried away more evidence bags. The name endured because it told the story as starkly as possible. Not a body found in the loch, but limbs. The remains of a young man, hacked apart and dumped like garbage in the dark water. And with every discovery, the question grew louder. Who would do this? And why target someone like Barry Wallace? The answer would point to a man who had already killed before, a man who had slipped through the cracks of justice, and a man whose crimes would soon make him one of Scotland's most hated killers. His name was William Beggs, and his story is far darker than anyone first realized. In the days after Barry Wallace was identified, detectives began piecing together his final movements. Witnesses from the Christmas party on December 4th recalled Barry leaving alone, but some remembered a man in the crowd who did not belong. He wasn't a coworker, and his presence felt out of place. At the same time, forensic specialists examined the bags recovered from Loch Lomond. Fibers, blood, and traces of DNA pointed in one direction. Within a week, the name of their prime suspect emerged: William Beggs. By the mid-1990s, William Beggs was living in Kilmarnock. He worked at a call center. He drove a sporty car. He even showed interest in local politics. To his neighbors, he seemed respectable, even ambitious. But that was a mask. Beneath it, Beggs was hiding a history of violence. He had not just been accused of murder before, he had already stood trial for it. Back in 1987, a man named Barry Oldham was found brutally murdered. The suspect was none other than William Beggs. The evidence against him was strong, and in 1988 he was convicted of murder. But just 1 year later, in 1989, his conviction was overturned on appeal because of legal technicalities. Beggs walked free. That should have been the end of his freedom. Instead, it was the beginning of something worse, because once again, the system had given him a second chance. In 1991, Beggs struck again. During an argument, he attacked a man with a razor, slashing his throat in a frenzied assault. The victim barely survived. For most criminals, this would have meant decades in prison. But not for Beggs. He served a reduced sentence and was released once again. By the mid-1990s, he was living freely in Kilmarnock, appearing respectable on the outside, but carrying the same violent urges that had already cost lives. When police raided Beggs's flat in December 1999, the truth became undeniable. Forensic experts found traces of Barry Wallace's blood embedded in the carpet. Fibers from Barry's clothing were discovered in the apartment. Microscopic DNA evidence mapped the violent struggle that had taken place inside. Investigators described the flat as a house of horrors. Barry had been restrained, killed, and then dismembered with methodical precision. Each part of his body was cut, bagged, and dumped into Loch Lomond, an attempt to scatter the evidence and erase his existence. But the loch had not hidden the crime. It had revealed it. By mid-December 1999, police had gathered enough evidence to charge William Beggs with the murder of Barry Wallace. His flat in Kilmarnock had revealed traces of Barry's blood, fibers, and DNA. But when officers arrived to arrest him, Beggs was gone. He had vanished. Almost immediately, news outlets across Scotland carried the headlines: "The limbs in the Loch Killer on the run." The public was terrified. A man capable of dismembering an innocent teenager was now free, and no one knew where he had gone. Only days after fleeing Scotland, Beggs appeared in the Netherlands. In a move that stunned investigators, he calmly walked into a police station in Amsterdam and surrendered himself. It was as if he believed he could outsmart the system again, just as he had in 1989 when his conviction was overturned. In 2001, William Beggs stood trial for the murder of Barry Wallace. The prosecution laid out a chilling case. Forensic experts testified that Barry's blood was found throughout Beggs's flat. Fibers matched clothing. DNA evidence tied Barry directly to the scene. Witnesses described seeing Barry in Beggs's company on the night of the Christmas party. The bags used to dump the body parts were the same type kept in Beggs's home. Every detail pointed in one direction. Beggs, however, denied everything. He claimed he was being framed. He tried to cast doubt on the forensic evidence. But the jury was not convinced. After weeks of testimony, The verdict came back. William Beggs was found guilty of the murder of Barry Wallace. He was sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum of 20 years before parole. For most killers, a life sentence is the end of the story. But William Beggs was different. He launched appeal after appeal, dragging his case through the courts for years. He even took his fight to the European Court of Human Rights, arguing that his rights had been violated during his trial. Each time, his claims were rejected. But the constant legal battles drained the resources. Reports suggest that Beggs's appeals cost taxpayers more than £1 million. It was as if he was determined to keep his name in the headlines, long after his crimes had shocked the nation. For the family of Barry Wallace, the conviction brought some measure of justice, but it could never erase the horror of what had been done to their son. Barry was just 18 years old, a boy with his whole life ahead of him. The name Limbs in the Loch became etched into Scotland's memory, not only because of the brutality of the crime, but because of the way the loch itself became part of the story. Every bag pulled from the water was another reminder of what had been stolen. To this day, Loch Lomond remains a place of beauty. Tourists come from around the world to see its still waters and green hills. But for those who remember December 1999, it's also a place of horror, because beneath that calm surface, it once held the remains of a boy cut to pieces by a man who should never have been free. William Beggs will forever be remembered as the Limbs in the Loch killer. And the question that lingers is chilling. How many lives could have been saved if justice had caught him the first time? Loch Lomond still reflects the sky like glass, but for those who know the story, it doesn't reflect peace. It reflects the memory of Barry Wallace, and the darkness of a man who believed he could carve a life into pieces and scatter it into the water. But the Loch refused to keep his secret. If this story left you unsettled, there are many more waiting in the shadows. Subscribe to Red Stains, and step with me into the cases that the world wishes it could forget.